Now that the U.S. has selected a new president, how will that impact expats and the Philippines? You may be asking yourself, does this change in U.S. leadership really affect me as an expat or potential expat? Well, I think the answer to that question is yes, it does impact you more than probably you think. Well, hi, I'm Eric, and welcome to my Island Expats channel. Today, I'm going to focus on the potential impacts from the election and how it could affect expats, the Philippines, and the world abroad from my perspective. My channel, Island Expats, focuses on the Philippines and the expat vlogger community. So my concern is for the general welfare of expats and the overall Filipino community. Well, first of all, U.S. leadership matters and has significant impact on economic and foreign policy. You might say, well, why is that important? Well, the role of the U.S. for quite some time has been to bring stability as the world's largest economy and military superpower. It keeps the peace, so to speak. So the person that runs this country has a significant impact on these policies. We've seen inflation, instability, and wars over the last 4 years. Let's face it, the world is a lot less stable than it was 4 years ago. Why? Because the foreign policy of the U.S. administration has more been about appeasement than leadership. I think that's a significant difference, especially from a foreign policy standpoint. Their agenda has been more, let's say, directed at home and not even sure on the right things. Anyway, the President of the United States is in charge of the world's strongest military and needs to use that role for strategic alliances that make the world a safer place for everyone. It takes a strong economy in order to be able to afford to build and maintain a strong military, which in the end keeps the peace. You know, I remember this story. I was back in college when this happened. And President Reagan told then Russian President Gorbachev, who was visiting him up in Santa Barbara. In fact, it's funny, Reagan had a ranch up there and a very small house. And when Gorbachev arrived and he saw the house, he goes, "Is this the maid's quarters?" Reagan's like, "No, that's where we live and that's what you're going to stay." Anyway, this conversation between Reagan and Gorbachev was interesting because they kind of became friends, these two adversaries. And basically, Reagan said to him, "Look, we're always going to beat you." And Gorbachev simply said, "Well, why do you think that?" And Reagan replied, "Because we will outspend you." That was true back in 1984, and that's still true today. It takes money and a strong economy to build and maintain a military, especially a world-leading superpower. The U.S. strategic alliance with the Philippines is more important than ever and will impact the safety and well-being of expats who live there, also the Filipino people, and even the stability of the entire region of the Southeast Asian area. With China right there in their backyard, wanting to take back Taiwan like you wouldn't believe, I can talk to that later, and so close to the Philippines, the alliance with the U.S. is more important than ever. I've traveled to China and Taiwan and several of the southeastern countries for the last 10 years, and recently have been in all of these countries and seen some things up close that makes me quite concerned. Well, fortunately, Marcos and Trump are said to have a good relationship already, and that will help with the alliance in the Philippines at least for the next 4 years, hopefully longer. When I was in China about a year ago, I witnessed in person the presence of Russian companies now forming alliances with Chinese companies. In fact, I was at this trade show talking to the general manager of this business, a Chinese business, and a Russian trade representative walked up just while I was standing there. And he said, the general manager to the Russian said, "Russia is now a very strong trading partner for China, based upon the new focus of the Chinese government and Russia alliance." Well, that just gave me chills up my spine, to say the least. And that's a big change from just a couple of years ago when I was over there. I didn't see any Russians. There's this trade show that happens twice a year. It's the largest trade show in the world. It's in Guangzhou, which is about 2 hours by train north of Hong Kong. And I've been there multiple times. And 5 years ago, I didn't see any Russians there. I've been there a couple of times in the last 2 years. And this last time in particular, last April it was, that's when I started seeing Russians show up and signs for Russian trading companies and alliances. It's quite scary that it's changing over there because it wasn't like that before. Well, anyway, this past September, I was in the Philippines. And while I was there, I met an Air Force guy who was stationed on the last base in South Korea, just across that demarcation line to North Korea. So he's the last bastion of soldiers between South Korea and North Korea from the U.S. This officer told me that they are expecting a war with China by 2027. Seems to be the target date. I find that interesting because I recently found a video on YouTube about an admiral from the U.S. Navy who's been looking at preparations for the same possibility of a war with China in 2027 and the overall readiness of the U.S. forces to compete in that war. In my view, having Trump in office now, or at least in January when it happens, will further the U.S. preparations and readiness with the hope to avoid this outcome. Strong leadership and strong military is how wars are kept from happening, especially a leader that's a bit unpredictable like Trump and is not afraid to mix things up to get some things done. You know, when Trump was in office before, he was the first U.S. president to move the U.S. embassy to the capital of Israel, which is Jerusalem. I think it moved from Tel Aviv, if I remember correctly. There are previous presidents that all promised to do this, but none of them ever did. They were afraid it would spark some type of a conflict. Well, Trump did it, and this is the reason why. On all the other U.S. embassies around the world, we have an embassy in the capital of each country. That's where it's supposed to be. We may also have some in some other cities, but the point is we have it in the capital of each country that the U.S. embassy is there to represent us. And in this case, in Israel, the previous presidents were afraid to move it to Jerusalem, and Trump did it. Well, you may be thinking, okay, great. So what does that have to do with me as an expat in the first place? And where are you going with all this? In my view, quite a bit actually has to do with you, and this is why. It's the stability of the region and of the world. The U.S. and Israel, historically, have been one of the strongest military-type alliances, both militarily and politically, as an alliance. This in the past has brought stability to the Middle East. In fact, the Abraham Accord that was signed and put into place during Trump's previous tenure brought a peace agreement between several Arab nations and Israel. The only Arab country in the whole area that really had a problem with it was Iran, and they did nothing but want to disturb the peace and cause us problems. In fact, what they did is they used their proxies, and they caused trouble, and that was part of the reason of the whole October 7th buildup a year ago. Iran uses these proxies in Hamas for Gaza and Palestine, for Hezbollah, which is across the border to the north in Lebanon, and the Houthis, which are out of Yemen, but another proxy to cause problems on the Red Sea, especially for shipping. So freighters are rerouted with containers now around that whole area, around Africa to Europe, increasing the cost of shipping. Well, all of these teams work together to help plan out with Hamas the October 7th, 2023 attack on Israel. And they did it because Iran, who's behind all of this, just doesn't fear the current U.S. administration because they're seen as being weak and non-committal, and that's the worst part of their foreign policy. These guys just don't get it that you need to project strength and have the military behind you and the administration behind you to have the peace. And that's why, in part, we are having so many issues around the world right now. So recently, Israel responded to Iran because Iran had on two separate occasions, shot hundreds of missiles across from Iran into Israel directly for the first time. Previously, they were using their proxies, right? When Israel responded by sending 100 fighter jets into Iran undetected and came back unscathed due to the two attacks that Iran did directly to Israel, which is the first time in history. So over the last 3 weeks, there have been two separate rocket attacks where there were hundreds of rockets fired from either the proxies or directly from Iran into the Israeli space. Most of those were shot down between the Israelis, the U.S., the British, and some other alliance partners there. But in response, Israel waited about 3 weeks, and then they sent in these 100 fighter pilot jets. And what these fighter jets did is it didn't seem like they were doing much. They actually took out the rocket-making capability and the launchers that launched them. It's a very strategic attack. And unfortunately, the U.S. called for restraint and put restrictions on Israel. And that's what this administration does. They could have gone in there and they could have gotten rid of their nuclear bomb capability, which they're supposed to be very close to putting together, maybe within weeks. But this was in part not to escalate things into a regional war. But it also continues the U.S. leadership policy of appeasement and apparent weakness on the world stage when we have the world's best military and the largest economy to fund it. Look, we need stability in the Middle East in order for the world to be a safer place for everyone. When there's instability there, then we see alliances like between the Iranian drones that have shown up over the last couple of years in the Ukraine war with Russia, or conflict, or whatever you want to call that. And then just in the last week or two, now Putin has asked for North Korea to send 10,000 troops into Russia to help fight the Ukrainians. That's very concerning because politically that widens the reach of the war beyond just a regional conflict. So this foreign policy of appeasement, they've even allowed North Korea now to have the nuclear bomb. They didn't have that under Trump's previous administration. So this appeasement just doesn't work. It makes the world an unsafe place. Foreign policy matters. And it's the way to create a stable world for everyone. So let's talk about economics a little bit and how U.S. policy in that affects expats. One of the primary effects is inflation. Inflation in the U.S. often affects inflation abroad, especially with U.S. trading partners. Have you noticed how everyday items have increased as much as 20% over the last 4 years in the U.S.? And a lot of those items abroad, including these items in the Philippines, are 20% more too. I feel like food in general has gone up by that. The basics of eggs, milk, meat, a lot of that's gone up by 20% or more. It's just amazing how expensive everything is now. You go out to eat to a restaurant in the U.S., and you're paying like 20% more than you were just a couple of years ago. Well, that type of impact does have an effect overseas too. Let's look at the cost of housing in the U.S. It's at an all-time high right now. Many people can't even afford to buy back their own home, let alone buy another one or a new one. And what about the younger generation that's just starting out, coming out of college? How in the world are they supposed to afford a home at these current prices? And then separately, and this is kind of a microcosm thing here in the Philippines, but there's some inflation in the areas like Dumaguete where there's a lot of expats, and that's pushing up the price of housing. So supply and demand is always at play. In the U.S., supposedly there's a housing shortage, and that's part of the increases. But there are other factors to that too. Now let's talk about the cost of living increases that go on to Social Security and other pension programs that are necessary and need to happen. But when they do, they also kind of form their own part of inflation, right? Because now you have a retired expat, let's say in a pension, he's got a little bit more buying power. His dollar goes a little bit further. Well, he needs to because inflation's ate up what the previous value was. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm just saying it's another way that the government creates inflation is through spending. That spending can be on government programs, It can be on things that are necessary, like your Social Security, so we get a cost of living increase. But my point to that is that it all creates inflation and makes goods more expensive. And in my mind, the spending for the government should be more preparing the military to be the most modern, most equipped, most prepared military in the world, because this is a very difficult time, and we've got some very threatening adversaries that like to do us harm, and we need to be prepared for that. In my opinion, Trump will usher in a period of prosperity, which will include the stock market and a favorable business climate. And that's going to be a challenge because the stock market has gone up in recent years. But I do think overall his policies are good for the country, especially in the business climate. Now, he's got to fix a bunch of the mess that they left behind from the previous administration, who, in my opinion, have just focused on the wrong agenda completely, and they have weakened and not strengthened our country. So Trump's going to have to fix this mess. It's not going to happen overnight. But I do believe that he is more pro-business, and he'll create a better economic climate over time. Whether you like Trump as a man himself or not, his policies last time when he was in office were good for the country. And he surrounds himself with highly successful people, which only helps to improve things. So let's talk about the stock market, because that's important. Why is the stock market important to an expat? Well, a lot of expats are on some type of pension plan, like a 401k payout or an IRA that's tied to stocks or annuities or bonds in the stock market. And so we need the markets to do well in order for those retirement funds to grow so that we have a hedge against inflation and have a greater future value down the road, right? So we want a favorable stock market. We want a favorable business climate. It only helps us to be wealthier and be prepared for the future. And this type of arrangement, the effect of markets and economic policy, interest rates, inflation, it directly impacts middle-aged expats especially, and those that are retired already, because it's a matter of how far your dollar is going to go, and that's the reason usually you go abroad. Now, ultimately, a stable economy with low inflation, which is typically gauged at 2% per year, is considered acceptable by the Federal Reserve, right? That will bring stability with not just the U.S., but with trading partners like the Philippines. Inflation does the opposite, it disrupts it. The other thing that gets affected are things like visa policies that would affect both expats and Filipinos, depending which way you're going. And those are often based upon how good that relationship is between the two countries. So the administration and the policies that are put in place as far as visas, immigration, cooperation between the U.S. and the Philippines could affect both sides of that equation. Basically, a more defined and positive alliance usually creates a more favorable environment and often reciprocal privileges for visa and immigration policies between those two countries. When that relationship is strained, these policies go in the opposite direction. You can see that right now in the Philippines as they're clamping down on particular visas because there are some bad actors that they're concerned about. Military cooperation is so important between the U.S. and the Philippines, as we have long-standing agreements for the U.S. that help protect the Philippines, including strategic military bases or the use of their military bases, and they're located so very close to China. Trump's approach to defense and military aid could affect joint exercises with the Philippines and other partners in the region, including Japan and South Korea. So the security of this relationship is really important between Trump, our defense capability, our military, and the Philippines administration, especially given the last few months where China continues to try to create a conflict with the Philippine Coast Guard or the Philippine Navy and the South China Sea. I view this change in leadership in the U.S. administration as a positive for expats that will help to bring stability and a stronger foreign policy that should help the Philippines. Trump has said, "A promise made is a promise kept." Let's hold him to that. But also, several people have said, maybe his life was spared during these multiple assassination attempts in order to help the country stabilize and make America great again. I hope that's the case, because I view this change in leadership as something that needed to happen. Well, I've given you things to think about today and a bit of a perspective from my standpoint, but I want to know what you think. Why don't you let me know in the comments how you think a change in this administration going to Trump and what he'll put in place affects expats both abroad and in the Philippines. Well, thanks for watching today, and be sure to check out other episodes of Island Expats and our weekly Expat Vlogger News program that comes out on Sunday mornings in the US here called Expat News. Take care, let's hope for a better future, and thanks for your support.